The cardboard box scraped against the polished hardwood floor, a sound like a dull wound opening in the quiet of the afternoon. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, or what used to be my bedroom, and watched my daughter-in-law, Jessica, toss the last of my books inside. She did it with a kind of brisk, efficient indifference, the way one might discard old newspapers or expired canned goods. There went my collection of Dickinson, the worn paperback of To Kill a Mockingbird I'd read to my son David a dozen times. The heavy leather-bound anthology of world poetry my late husband Arthur had given me on our 25th anniversary. Each spine that disappeared into the box was a memory being erased. "There," she said, wiping a delicate hand on her yoga pants, a triumphant little puff of air escaping her lips. So much cleaner. All that clutter was just collecting dust. She turned to me, her smile as bright and sterile as the white walls she'd insisted on painting over my warm, buttery yellow. She saw me looking at the box, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. "Oh, don't give me that look, Margaret," she sighed, the name a deliberate choice over Mom. She'd stopped calling me Mom the day David got his big promotion. "It's for the best. We're turning this into a proper guest suite for when my parents visit. They need a calm, minimalist space, not a dusty old library." I found my voice, though it felt thin and reedy, a stranger in my own throat. "Those were Arthur's books, Jessica. Some of them were his father's." She waved a dismissive hand, the diamond on her finger catching the light. "Exactly. They're old. They smell old." She picked up one last volume that had fallen to the floor, a slim book of Robert Frost's poems, its cover soft with age. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. "Besides," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of mock sympathy she reserved for moments of peak cruelty, "old people don't need stories. You've already lived yours." And with that, she tossed the Frost into the box and sealed the flaps with a screech of packing tape. She didn't look at me again. She simply dragged the box toward the hallway, leaving a long, faint scratch on the floor. I watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading as she headed for the garage, where the books would wait for the garbage truck on Tuesday. I didn't move. I stood in the empty room, the ghosts of my bookshelves stark against the white walls. The air, scrubbed clean of the scent of old paper and leather and ink, felt thin, unbreathable. She was wrong. It wasn't that old people didn't need stories. It was that some people, the young and the hungry and the heartless, believed they had the right to edit your story out of existence, to tear out the pages that made you who you are, leaving you a blank, convenient space for them to occupy. I thought of the box, sitting in the cold darkness of the garage. I thought of all those years, all those memories, piled on top of each other, waiting for disposal. But then I thought of one book in particular, my favorite one, the one she'd missed. It wasn't in the box, because it was never on the shelves. It was in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, wrapped in a silk scarf. And Jessica, in all her frantic, minimalist cleansing, had forgotten to throw out the nightstand. She hadn't checked the inside cover. She had no idea what story that book really held. In that cold, empty room, a different kind of story began to write itself in my mind. Not one of endings, but one of reckonings. It wasn't just the books, of course. It was never just about the books. It was about the house itself, a place built not with bank loans and architectural plans, but with decades of quiet sacrifice. Arthur and I bought this land in a sleepy suburb of Atlanta, back when it was just a stretch of Georgia clay and towering pine trees. We were young, impossibly so, and had nothing but calluses on our hands and a shared dream in our hearts. Arthur wasn't a wealthy man. He was a high school history teacher who believed in the power of a good story and a well-built foundation. I remember the weekends we spent framing the walls ourselves, our son David, then just a small boy with scraped knees and a galaxy of freckles, helping by handing his father nails one by one. I remember painting the living room, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the honeysuckle drifting in through the open windows. Arthur would read poetry aloud to me from the very books Jessica had just condemned to the trash heap. He'd stand on a ladder, paintbrush in hand, and recite Whitman or Sandburg, his voice a low, steady rumble that made the house feel more like a home than any furniture ever could. This house watched us grow old together. It saw David's first steps, his first heartbreak, the day he left for college with his father's old suitcase and my secret stash of $20 bills tucked into his socks. It was in this house that Arthur got sick. The last year of his life was spent in the sunroom, surrounded by his books, where he could watch the cardinals at the bird feeder. He'd hold my hand, his grip weaker each day, and tell me, "Maggie, this house is our story. It's written in the floorboards. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's not yours." When David married Jessica, I was so hopeful. She was ambitious and polished, everything I wasn't. I thought she would bring a new energy into our lives. For a while she did, but her ambition had sharp edges. After Arthur passed, they moved in, ostensibly to take care of me. It was their idea. "You shouldn't be alone in this big house, Mom," David had said, though he couldn't quite meet my eyes. The truth was, they couldn't afford a place of their own, not in the neighborhood they wanted. My house, paid off and mortgage-free, was the perfect solution. I agreed, because what mother wouldn't? I thought we would be a family, a 3-generation household filled with the kind of warmth I'd only read about. But Jessica saw the house not as a home, but as an asset, a canvas she could whitewash, literally and figuratively, until no trace of my life with Arthur remained. She started small. The floral curtains I'd sewn by hand were replaced with cold, gray blinds. The family photos on the mantel were gradually swapped out for abstract art. David, my sweet David, who once cried when I told him the ending of Where the Red Fern Grows, just went along with it. "It's just stuff, Mom," he'd say with a shrug. "Jessica has a good eye for design." He didn't see that she wasn't just redesigning a house. She was dismantling a history. My history. Our history. The books were the last bastion. They were Arthur's soul, lined up on the shelves he built himself. They were my comfort on long, lonely nights. When Jessica called them clutter, it was the final, deepest cut. She wasn't just throwing away paper and ink. She was throwing away Arthur. She was throwing away the very foundation of the home she now claimed as her own. She called me Margaret, a name only bill collectors and doctors had ever used. She made it clear I was a tenant, a relic, a problem to be managed. But as I stood there, reeling from her casual cruelty, Arthur's words came back to me, clear as the day he spoke them. "Don't ever let anyone tell you it's not yours." And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the time for being a quiet, accommodating old woman was over. The story wasn't finished yet. I was about to write a new chapter. The weeks following the Great Book Purge were a masterclass in quiet cruelty. Jessica operated with the precision of a surgeon, excising every last trace of my existence from the house while maintaining a veneer of perfect, daughterly concern for anyone who might be watching. The disrespect was no longer just in words. It was in every action, every rearranged piece of furniture, every closed door. My world, which had already shrunk after Arthur's passing, was now being condensed into a single, suffocating room. One evening, I came downstairs to find my favorite armchair, the worn floral one where Arthur and I had spent countless evenings, gone. In its place stood a sleek leather monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a sterile corporate lobby. When I asked where my chair was, Jessica didn't even look up from her phone. "Oh, that old thing. It's in the garage. It didn't match the new aesthetic. It was shedding." It wasn't shedding. It was simply old, like me. David stood by, stirring his soup, his silence a heavy cloak of complicity. I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to build forts with me out of those very chair cushions. He just gave a slight shake of his head, a silent plea for me to drop it, to not make a scene. Making a scene was the greatest sin in Jessica's carefully curated world. Then came the issue of meals. I'd always loved to cook, but Jessica slowly took over the kitchen, filling it with organic, gluten-free ingredients I couldn't pronounce and gadgets I didn't know how to use. She started preparing my meals separately, simple, bland dishes she'd leave on a tray outside my door, as if I were an invalid or a prisoner. "It's just easier this way, Margaret," she'd say brightly. "Your dietary needs are so specific." My needs weren't specific. I just liked a little salt in my food. The message was clear. You are other. You are not part of our table. The final straw, before the real storm broke, was the family photograph. For as long as I could remember, we'd taken a Christmas photo. After Arthur died, it was just David, his family, and me. But last Christmas, Jessica hired a professional photographer. She insisted on coordinating outfits, crisp whites and denims. She handed me a beige cardigan that washed me out completely. When the photographer was setting up the shot by the fireplace, she turned to him and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Let's do a few with just our core family first. You know, for the real Christmas card." I was instructed to stand off to the side. I watched as my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson smiled for the camera, a perfect, self-contained unit. After a dozen shots, the photographer turned to Jessica. "And now with..." He trailed off, gesturing toward me. Jessica glanced at her watch. "Oh, I think we have all we need. We're losing the light." They never took the photo with me. The next week, their Christmas card arrived in the mail, addressed to the Johnsons. The photo on the front was of the three of them, radiant and complete. I wasn't cropped out. I had never been in the frame to begin with. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to the dismantling of my own life. They thought I was weak, forgetful, a relic who could be stored in the garage along with the other unwanted furniture. They saw my silence as acceptance. They mistook my grief for senility. They had forgotten who I was. I was the woman who had managed 3 part-time jobs while raising a son alone. I was the woman who had negotiated with contractors and balanced the books for Arthur's small side business. I was the woman who had held this family together with sheer grit and unwavering love. They had thrown out my stories, but they forgot I was a story myself, and my story was far from over. I just needed the right book to prove it. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind sounded like a judgment. At 3 a.m., when the world was shrouded in a deep, impenetrable silence, I slipped out of bed. The house was cold, but a fire was burning in my chest. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors that my own savings had paid for. The garage was frigid, and the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and discarded things. I found the box labeled books, and with trembling fingers, slit the tape with my old gardening knife. I dug through the pile, my heart aching with each familiar spine I touched. I wasn't looking for all of them, just one, and then I found it, at the very bottom, the slim volume of Robert Frost. Jessica had tossed it in last. I pulled it out and held it to my chest for a moment, the worn cover cool against my nightgown. I carried it back to my room, closing the door with a soft click. By the dim light of my bedside lamp, I opened the book. It didn't fall open to "The Road Not Taken" or stopping by Woods on a snowy evening. It fell open to the inside cover, a space Arthur had ingeniously hollowed out himself years ago. It had been our little secret, our private vault for things that mattered more than money. My hands, no longer trembling, were steady as I retrieved the contents. First came the deed, not a copy, but the original hand-signed document from 1987. The paper was thick and brittle, and my name, Margaret Ann Johnson, was written right alongside Arthur's in the elegant script of the county clerk. I had co-signed, put down the majority of the deposit from an insurance policy my father had left me. I was not a guest. I was a co-owner. Next, I pulled out a small folded bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from Jessica's father to Arthur, written over a decade ago. I read them again, though I knew their contents by heart. They were desperate pleas for a loan. Jessica's father's business was failing, and he was on the brink of bankruptcy. Arthur, with his boundless generosity, had lent him $75,000, a staggering sum for us back then. It was our entire life savings, the money we'd set aside for our own retirement. The letters were filled with promises of repayment, promises that were never kept. The loan was a secret, a matter of family pride, and after both her father and Arthur passed, it was a secret Jessica had conveniently forgotten. But the letters, legally considered promissory notes, were proof. And finally, at the very bottom, was a single, crisp business card. It read, Harrison Reed, Esquire, Attorney at Law. Below the name, in Arthur's familiar scrawl, was a note. Maggie, if they ever forget who built this house, Harry will remember. He owes me a favor. Harry. I hadn't thought of him in years. He was Arthur's old army buddy, a man with a mind as sharp as a tack and a reputation for being a bulldog in the courtroom. He was the most feared family lawyer in the state. I laid the 3 items on my nightstand: the deed, the letters, the card, my armor, my ammunition. They had tried to throw my story away, but they had failed. They thought I was a powerless old woman, a collection of dusty memories. They had no idea that I was the keeper of the truth, the executor of a silent promise. I looked at the phone, then at the business card. It was too early to call, but the decision had been made. I would not be erased. I would not be discarded. I would not go quietly into the garage. They had left me with nothing but a single book of poems. They were about to find out it was the only thing I ever needed. The road not taken, I was about to take it, and it was going to lead straight to a lawyer's office. The law offices of Harrison Reed were exactly as I remembered from 20 years ago: old brick, ivy climbing the walls, and an air of quiet, unshakable authority. When I walked in, the scent of old leather and brewing coffee felt like a shield. Mr. Reed, Harry, was older now, his hair a distinguished silver, but his eyes were the same. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. He greeted me not with pity, but with a firm handshake and a warm, "Margaret, it's been too long. Arthur would be furious if he knew I let you stay away this long." We sat in his expansive office, a wall of law books behind him like a silent army. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I opened my handbag and laid the contents of the Frost book on his polished mahogany desk. The original deed, the bundle of letters from Jessica's father, and finally the invoice for the new roof I had paid for out of pocket 2 years ago, a detail I had almost forgotten. Harry picked up the deed first, examining it under the light. "Well, this is as clear as day, Margaret. Joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. This house is as much yours as it was Arthur's. You are not a guest. You are the owner." His words were a balm on a wound I didn't know was still so raw. Then he moved to the letters, reading each one slowly, his expression hardening. When he finished the last one, he looked up at me. his eyes blazing with a cold fire. $75,000, he said, his voice a low growl. 75. I remember Arthur telling me about this. He was too good of a man to ever call in a debt from family. He considered it a gift. It was not a gift, I said, my own voice firm, surprising me with its strength. It was a loan, and it was never repaid. With interest, compounded over 12 years. Harry began tapping numbers into a calculator on his desk. We're looking at a debt of over $150,000. Jessica, as her father's heir, inherited that debt the moment she inherited his estate. Did she ever declare it? She declared that he left her nothing but debt, so she took nothing, I replied. But she took his antique watch collection and his car. She just didn't declare the money he owed us. Harry leaned back, a grim smile playing on his lips. Oh, she's clever, but not clever enough. These letters are legally binding promissory notes. Her failure to disclose this debt to you while living in a house you funded is fraudulent concealment. He steepled his fingers, looking at me with a newfound respect. Margaret, you're not just sitting on a moral high ground here. You're sitting on a legal fortress. He laid out the plan with military precision. First, he would file a lien against the house for the full amount of the unpaid loan, plus interest. This would immediately freeze any attempts they might make to sell or refinance the property. Second, he would send a formal letter of demand to both David and Jessica, outlining the debt and giving them 30 days to present a repayment plan. And if they don't, I asked, my heart thumping. Then we file suit, he said without hesitation. And we bring up the fraudulent deed she tried to have you sign, the one throwing you out. We bring up the fact that you've been paying the utilities. We bring up everything. We won't just be asking for the money, Margaret. We'll be asking the court to partition the property. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. That means forcing a sale of the house and dividing the assets according to ownership. Since you can prove you paid the down payment and have been covering costs, the court will likely award you a share far greater than 50%. They could lose everything. I took a deep breath. It was more than I had imagined. It was total. I don't want to leave my son homeless, Harry. You won't, he said gently. You're going to give him a choice. He can start treating his mother with the respect she's owed, or he can learn what it's like to have the roof over his head depend on the kindness of a stranger. It's a lesson he should have learned a long time ago. He picked up the phone. Let's get the paperwork started. As I walked out of that office, the Atlanta sun felt warmer on my skin. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I was no longer a ghost. I was a creditor, and the bill was coming due. The letter from Harrison Reed, Esquire, arrived on a Tuesday. It came via certified mail, which meant Jessica had to sign for it herself at the door. I watched from the kitchen window as she took the crisp, white envelope from the mail carrier, a flicker of annoyance on her face that quickly morphed into confusion. She tore it open right there on the porch, her perfectly manicured nails ripping the paper with uncharacteristic haste. I didn't need to see her face up close to know the exact moment she understood. Her shoulders went stiff, her head snapped up, and her eyes scanned the house, finally landing on the kitchen window where I stood. For a fraction of a second, our gazes locked. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock, as if a ghost she'd long since buried had just sat down at her breakfast table. She crumpled the letter in her fist and stormed inside, slamming the front door so hard the crystal vase on the entryway table rattled. I didn't move. I simply took a slow sip of my tea and waited. The quiet that followed was more terrifying than any shouting match. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality beginning to fracture. David came home early that day. I heard his car pull into the driveway, followed by the sound of the front door opening, and then Jessica's voice, a high, strained whisper. She knows, David. She knows everything. The loan, everything. She has a lawyer. I stayed in my room, the door slightly ajar, listening. Their hushed, frantic argument was a symphony of my vindication. How could she know? David's voice was laced with disbelief. Dad said that was all handled. The lawyer's name is Harrison Reed, Jessica spat. Does that mean anything to you? A long pause. Oh, God. Harry. Dad's army friend. I thought he was retired. He's not retired, David. He's threatening to put a lien on the house for $150,000. He says we have to present a repayment plan in 30 days or he's forcing a sale. Her voice cracked on the last word. That's insane. We don't have that kind of money. Where would we even go? Their panic was a cold, satisfying dish. They had never once considered where I would go. The garage, I suppose. Or perhaps they'd simply hoped I'd evaporate. Later that evening, they approached me together. They stood in the doorway of my room, their faces a mixture of fear and fury. They looked like children who had been caught with their hands in the cookie jar, except the cookies were my life savings and the jar was my home. Mom, David began, trying to sound reasonable, the way he did when he was about to ask for something he knew he didn't deserve. There's been a misunderstanding. This letter from Mr. Reed, I looked up from the book I was reading, my copy of Frost, which I had reclaimed from the box in the garage. There's no misunderstanding, David. It's a bill. Jessica stepped forward, her shock now replaced by a familiar sneer. You went behind our backs? After everything we've done for you? Letting you live here? I closed my book, marking my page with my finger. Letting me live here? I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. Jessica, I paid the down payment on this house with my inheritance. The unpaid loan from your father could have paid for that down payment twice over. For the past year, I have paid the property taxes and the electricity bill because you kept forgetting. You are not letting me live here. The truth is, I have been letting you live here. The color drained from her face. David just stared, his mouth slightly agape. They had no defense. The facts were not on their side. You should speak to Mr. Reed, I said, picking up my book again. He is handling all communication regarding my assets from now on. I dismissed them with a turn of the page, but I heard Jessica's parting shot as she pulled David from the room. This isn't over, you ungrateful old woman. You have no idea what you've just started. But she was wrong. For the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what I had started. I was finishing my story on my own terms, and they were about to find out that the meek, forgetful old woman they had tried to erase had a perfect memory and a very, very good lawyer. The 30 days passed in a tense, suffocating silence. David and Jessica treated me like a lit fuse, tiptoeing around me with a mixture of fear and resentment. They made no attempt to apologize, no offer of repayment. They were waiting, I realized, for me to lose my nerve, to feel guilty, to back down as I always had. They underestimated me. They always had. On the 31st day, Harry filed the petition to partition the property. The confrontation came that evening. I was in the living room, in my floral armchair, which I had quietly retrieved from the garage, when they cornered me. They didn't look like a power couple anymore. They looked like cornered animals. Jessica held a new legal document in her hand, her knuckles white. A partition sale? She seethed, her voice trembling with rage. Are you insane? You're going to make us sell our home? Rage. Your grandson's home? It is also my home, I said, my voice even. The one you tried to throw me out of. The one whose books you threw in the trash. David stepped forward, his face etched with a desperate panic. Mom, please. We can't afford to move. The market is terrible. We'll be ruined. Is that what you want? To ruin your own son? This was the moment, the final, desperate play for my guilt. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man I no longer recognized, and I felt a profound sadness, but not a shred of guilt. I stood up slowly and walked over to the bookshelf, the one I had restocked with the books I'd salvaged from the box. I pulled out the slim volume of Robert Frost. I opened it to the inside cover and walked back to them. I didn't hand it to them. I held it open for them to see. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. They stared, confused. "It's a book, one of the many you said old people don't need." I pointed to the papers tucked inside. "This," I said, tapping the deed, "is the proof that I am not a guest here. My name is on it. My money paid for it. This," I tapped the letters, "is the proof that your family owes mine a debt of honor that you chose to ignore, a debt of money that you chose to conceal." I looked directly at Jessica. "You called me an ungrateful old woman, but you have been living a comfortable life, funded by the very woman you disrespected. You wear expensive clothes, drive a luxury car, and host lavish parties in a house built on the foundation of my sacrifices, on the ghost of a loan you pretended didn't exist." Then I turned to David. "And you stood by and watched. You let her call me a burden. You let her erase me from our family's life. You let her throw away your father's memory piece by piece because you were too weak to stand up to her. You ask if I want to ruin you. The question, David, is why did you want to ruin me?" He had no answer. He just looked at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jessica, however, had one last fight in her. "This is blackmail," she hissed. "No," Harry's voice cut through the tension. He was standing in the archway to the dining room. I had called him an hour ago, asking him to be present. "This is a legal proceeding. It's called an accounting. And frankly, after reviewing the evidence, your best case scenario is that you sell this house, pay Margaret what you owe, and walk away with enough to rent a small apartment. Your worst case scenario involves charges of elder fraud and perjury." Jessica's face went ashen. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. I looked from my son's bowed head to my daughter-in-law's stricken face. I felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sorrow for what they had broken. "You said I didn't need stories anymore," I said, my voice soft but clear. "But you forgot the most important one, the one about consequences." I closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. The story was finally being told. In the end, there was no dramatic courtroom battle. Faced with the mountain of evidence Harry had compiled, the deed, the promissory notes, the utility bills in my name, even a sworn affidavit from a neighbor who had witnessed Jessica berating me in the front yard, they surrendered. Their lawyer advised them to settle, and fast. The partition sale went through, but not on the open market. In a final, quiet act of power, I bought them out. Using a portion of the repaid loan from Jessica's inheritance debt, I became the sole owner of the house Arthur and I had built. The paperwork was signed in Harry's office. David and Jessica sat on the opposite side of the table, never once making eye contact with me. They were given 60 days to vacate the premises. The day they moved out was a gray, overcast Saturday. I sat on the porch swing, a cup of tea in my hands, and watched the moving truck pull away. David paused at the end of the driveway, looked back at the house, and then at me. There were no words, just a look of profound, hollow loss. He got in his car and followed the truck down the street, disappearing from my life as quietly as he had faded from my side years ago. I didn't feel joy. I felt quiet. The house was mine again, every inch of it. The silence was no longer tense and threatening. It was peaceful. I spent the next week reclaiming my space. I moved the floral armchair back to its rightful place by the fire. I hung the old family photos on the mantel. I filled the bookshelves until they were overflowing with the stories of my life. One afternoon, my grandson, who was now staying with me 2 weekends a month as part of a new court-approved arrangement, helped me unpack the last box from the garage. He pulled out the chipped nativity scene. "Can we fix this, Grandma?" he asked, holding up the Joseph with the missing hand. "Of course we can, sweetheart," I said, my heart swelling. "Everything can be fixed with a little time and a little love." I never saw Jessica again. David sends polite, brief emails with updates about our grandson. They live in a small rented townhouse across town. He works a second job to make ends meet. I don't know if he ever understood the depth of what he lost. Not the house, but the home. My home is no longer silent. It's filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of my grandson's laughter, and the rustle of turning pages. Harry comes by for coffee sometimes, and we sit and talk about Arthur and the old days. I am not lonely. I am content. My story was not thrown away. I simply had to rescue it from the hands of those who didn't deserve to read it.